There you go. Uh, Hello and welcome out, everyone. First things first, there is a quiz going right now that you guys need to take. If you haven't taken it already, be sure to take it before the end of tomorrow. It is available for the rest of today and the rest of Friday. It's 5 questions, multiple choice, just like all the rest of the quizzes. Very simple. Um, not as not a significant proportion of your grade, but it does indicate how well you're doing. Um, Before we get started, any questions on that? All right, so let's hit the screen share, and that's the Zoom window. There you go. Um, so today we're talking about what's often called the long 1960s. Um, Whenever you hear a historian say long something, like long 19th century, long 18th century, whatever, or long 1960s, uh, it's an excuse to expand the time period rather than talking about the actual 1960 to 69. We're more talking about 1960 to the early 1970s to basically 1974. Um, and this time was a time of significant hope for the future. Um, while there was a lot of struggle to kind of overcome the past, um, you know, there's the space race going on. There's you know this whole political movement called the New Left that would arise throughout this time period. And so there's significant hope for change. Um, but we'll see in the next lecture that kind of crashes upon the 1970s, which is often known as the crisis of confidence. Um, but until that point, um, things looked to be moving in a progressive direction. Um, and this was most prominently made by the counterculture. Um, so we spoke a little bit about the anti-war movement in the previous lecture, but the counterculture arose um, not so much just to protest the Vietnam War, but to protest conformity and that kind of 50s idea of the atomic family and um, and especially civil rights because of the civil rights movement. All these folks who were born just after World War II were growing up um, while all of this was going on and seeing that like civil rights were being punished by police and that kind of thing. They uh, they watched as the Vietnam War picked up and didn't like that, and so they they saw the conformity of the 1950s as kind of allowing these things to happen, and so they became a dissident culture, hence counterculture. They were countering that what they called square culture, um, as in that conformity of the 1950s, that complacency over civil rights and the Vietnam War. Um, but this was not merely about um, protest; it was its own culture, and most prominently was the sexual revolution as part of this. Um, so in 1960, the FDA approved what we often call the pill, as in birth control pills that women had the ability to take a pill and not get pregnant. Um, even though they were having even with unprotected sex. Condoms had been around for um, well over a century, but the pill made it significantly easier to have unprotected sex. Um, so this fostered this idea of free love, um, where non-marital sex became a lot more commonplace. It's not as though people weren't having sex out of wedlock prior to this point, but you had places like the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, um, literally just um, having people have free love, as they called it. Um, and this kind of led to like a golden age of pornography, for instance, in the late 1960s all the way through the 1970s. Um, to the point that you'd have theaters with pornography in that, like people would literally go to a theater to watch pornography together, um, and and you'd have major blockbusters. For instance, in 1972, one of the one of the most watched movies of that year was a pornography called Deep Throat. So, and this was quite a different point of view in terms of sex compared to um the idea of sex before marriage and all that kind of stuff that um previous generations were fostering, let's say. um this also led to basically a new form of feminism. We talked earlier in class about the first wave, which led to the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage, in that they were called suffragettes. The second wave focused on legal restrictions on women. So the uh, the second wave really started trying to look at patriarchy and that kind of thing. Um, and there's two different competing parts of the second wave and all subsequent waves, which is there's liberal feminists who who are uh, more focused on the legal restrictions, and then there's radical feminists who are looking for some kind of revolution. But they came together to create this movement. For instance, in 1963, the kind of progenitor of this second wave was a lady named Betty Friedan, who wrote a book called The Second Sex, which was based on a French lady named Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. And it basically discussed the power of the patriarchy and how it suppressed women culturally. This led to a big push for what they had been pushing since the first wave, which was a new amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, um, which passed the Senate in 1972 and would be out for ratification for another 7 years, though we'll find in the next lecture that did not go so well. But that became the entire push of the second wave. They went from in 1963, for instance, there was the passage of the Equal Pay Act, which supposedly was to make it illegal to pay women differently on the basis of their gender. It didn't get enforced. It's not enforced. It actually didn't really have any enforcement mechanism. So it's still the pay gap is still a major issue today. um, though it's a little less overt as it used to be, to say the least. And on the tail of the feminist movement came the gay liberation movement, the LGBT rights. Um, in Now it's not like there hadn't already been gay rights movements prior to the second wave. There was, for instance, the 1950 Medellin Society in San Francisco. Um, in 1952, there was one incorporated. 1955, Daughters of Bilitis, which was a lesbian organization. So you can see there was already a great deal of movement to um, make uh, the main thing that was opposed to gay rights were sodomy laws. Basically, anything that wasn't vaginal penetration would be illegal, um, as a form of sex, and therefore um, criminalized gay people. There were also far worse versions of this where gay people were seen as being psychologically deviant, and they'd be hospitalized under that. They'd uh, they'd you know be chemically castrated and things along those lines. Pretty obvious violations of their civil rights. Um, and what propelled this into the fore was a riot that happened during a breakup at a gay bar called Stonewall in 1969. Um, and so this led to a riot. And instead of it just devolving into open violence in that, um, it went the other direction and evolved into protests that continue to the present. Um, if you've ever been to a gay pride parade, and that typically those happen on the anniversary of Stonewall. That's why they happen on a specific day. Gay Pride Day um, is on the anniversary of Stonewall. Um, so the LGBT rights movement really got its start in 1969. And all of this was part of that sexual revolution. Um, you know, it's kind of significant that the pill was legalized in 1960 and then all of this stuff happens. Um, Alongside that was new drugs. So it's not as though drugs uh, were legal at this throughout the 1960s, but were um, they were made illegal through taxation. So, for instance, a guy named Timothy Leary um, popularized the drug LSD, um, which was initially created during World War II as a as kind of a form of as an experimental drug for some kind of possible military use. It really didn't go so well as for military use, obviously. But Timothy Leary um, talked about what he called turn on, tune in, and drop out. And he really pushed this idea that LSD was, mind expanding. He was a professor up at UC Berkeley, and and he he really pushed this stuff, but then was arrested for tax evasion because they tried to tax LSD out of um, existence, and so he was arrested for that. But he was charged with marijuana possession. because even though marijuana had actually been made um had actually been made legal in um well, it had been legal for most of US history. It was made illegal in 1937 through these kinds of tax laws. um Leary himself said that the MJ was planted, but he was quite a well-known um, drug user, and he went to jail for that over in my old hometown, San Luis Obispo, at what's called the men's colony. He actually escaped once from there um, while he was in prison, making his prison sentence even longer as a result. Um, but this drug use became quite a significant part of the counterculture. This idea that it was mind expanding and um, that it could help people, just be better people. Um, and then, of course, there was the Rock that supported this entire movement. Um, had become, as we talked about last week, had already become kind of the predominant genre of popular music. But rock took on this psychedelic edge during this time as part of the counterculture. Um, Rock music was kind of the popular arm of the counterculture. You guys should have listened to a bunch of rock music for the assigned readings, I guess you'd call it, for this week. It's not, assigned listenings, I guess, is more accurate. But um, if we have time, we can go through some more psychedelic rock. Um, but in as part of this kind of protest culture that was built into this psychedelic rock, you had big movements. For instance, in 1967, there was the Summer of Love, where a bunch of where a San Francisco congregation that San Francisco had a bunch of people come together in the hinterlands across the bay um, to basically just have a bunch of rock concerts. This became quite controversial, especially when the governor of California was this guy named Ronald Reagan, and he didn't like the fact that they were coming together to do a bunch of concerts without permits. But it was basically just allowed to happen. Um, and the difference being, though, that the Summer of Love did not really have a lot of politics built into it. This is more about this kind of sexual revolution. You know, remember that um, this was prior to the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is really what changed public opinion towards negatively viewing the Vietnam War. Um, but a major rock concert that was going to happen in upstate New York in a place called Woodstock became kind of the focal point of this kind of political rock, um, and it was meant to just be kind of a big rock festival, but it ended up being a whole lot bigger than they expected. Um, and kind of became the focal point of the counterculture all around. There was significant amount of drug usage. You could see people running around naked and all kinds of stuff. It was a wacky time. Those few days in upstate New York, um, and well, as the poster says, it was supposed to be 3 days of peace and music. So you can already see on the poster itself, it had a political bent. Um, and this ended up being kind of the largest music festival of all time, with perhaps as many as 500,000 people in attendance at any on any given day. Um, and that became quite a traffic problem. Um, and later on, rock music kind of evolved from psychedelic rock to prog rock, progressive rock, as people experimented with stuff. You had things like Led Zeppelin um, and Rush and those kinds of folks experimenting with style and eventually evolving into funk, um, which was not necessarily rock, but its own thing that would eventually turn into disco, which we'll see has significant effects in the 1970s for next week. All of this, um, all the people participating in all of this stuff were called hippies. And so hippies is actually based off of a form of derision for the beatniks. You might remember us talking about the beatniks from last week. And a form of derision for the beatniks was the term hipster. And the term hipster um, morphed into just hippies. And this was, these people who embodied the counterculture. They literally, like, men would wear long hair and long beards. They'd openly engage in this free love and all this kind of stuff, and drugs and psychedelic rock, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? um, but it was kind of a hope that built into this whole thing, that it would change US culture for the better, that um free love and um that and this drug usage and rock and roll would kind of take away from that sterile conformity of the 1950s. um and bolstering this kind of hope was something that the US was really engaging in for uh, the Cold War, but everyone hoped would be a sign of things to come, and that's the space race. Throughout the 1960s, the space race really picked up. In 1961, John F. Kennedy announced basically a race to the moon, saying, these are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. Our strength, as well as our convictions, have imposed upon this nation the role of leader in freedom's cause. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind, more important for the long range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Um, and he would later simplify all of that to probably one of the most favorite quotes of his presidency. And a year later at Rice University, he said, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." Um, so the this kind of announced, like, where the space race would go, because up until that point the US was definitely losing the space race, to say the least. um, the Russians had gotten the first satellite in space, they'd gotten the first man in space, they'd gotten the first woman in space. um, they were winning the space race. um, but the idea was that that was just a minor setback, and the U.S. would strive ahead. And you'll notice in a lot of that language of from JFK, that talking about freedom and that. So this kind of talk resonated with the nascent counterculture. Um, and so there was this hope for mankind that you know that the arc of history tends towards freedom, right? So of course the hard work of going to the moon um, took a lot of time, and in 1961 that going to the moon seemed like a pie in the sky idea, though you can already see it was achieved by the picture here. Um, but you had the Mercury program from 1958 to 1963, which was our kind of first space capsules. Then you had the Gemini program, which was kind of the testing manned space flight in that was in orbit, rather than just getting to space. So there were 12 crewed space flights from 1964 to 66 under the Gemini program. Um, the They were mostly testing like various things that would be needed to go to the moon, for instance docking in space, um and um trying to trying to start beating the Soviets in terms of space achievements. With the first thing that we finally beat the Soviets in, which was a rendezvous in high Earth orbit. Um, this, mind you, was all happening on the back of the of nuclear missiles. That first and foremost, these missiles were designed for destroying the Soviet Union rather than launching people into space. The Mercury program were literally just uh, uh, um, taking out the warhead of a Trident missile and putting in a space capsule. But um, this kind of was seen as a bit of an issue that arming space, and so this led to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, or the long name being the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. Um, so this treaty officially banned weapons use in space. We couldn't weaponize space. And was kind of integral to the next step, which was the Apollo program, which started that same year. The Apollo program first, attempted, it wasn't a launch, but they were testing an Apollo, the first Apollo rocket, when 3 crew members ended up burning inside because they were using a pure oxygen atmosphere for them, and that meant that any kind of spark would literally light the entire capsule on fire. I will not play the audio, but you can actually hear the audio on NASA's website, and you can hear that they start saying there's a fire, and then they start screaming. This was quite a setback, to say the least. And so for an entire year, the Apollo program went uncrewed, all the way until April of 1968, when Apollo 6 launched the first crewed Apollo mission. and they were testing the new types of rockets. This was um, the what's called the Apollo 4. I mean, not the Apollo, the Saturn 4A. And eventually they were working towards what's called a Saturn V rocket, one of the most powerful rockets we've ever made. And by 1969, they'd gone, they'd tested um, the rockets, they'd tested the ability to take out the lunar lander, they'd actually flown around the moon once, and with Apollo 10, and with Apollo 11, they landed on the moon. And you know, one of the most watched events in television history was um, the landing on the moon. Though apparently the Super Bowl that year had actually gotten more viewership, interestingly enough. But there would be several more missions to the moon, ending in Apollo 17 in 1972. But as the song goes, as one of the songs that you guys will be listening to for the reading assignments, you may leave here for 4 days in space, but when you return, it's the same old place. So while all of this is going on, and this kind of counterculture and hope in the space race and all that, excuse me, there was still Vietnam going on, and all of those race riots that we talked about in the civil rights lecture. Pictured here is, of course, Vietnam on the top, but on the bottom is Detroit in 1967. You'll notice that that's still Army equipment on the bottom there. It's a tank in Detroit, because they deployed tanks to put down the rioting during the long hot summer. And they would do the same thing during the MLK riots a year later. This meant that as one song put it, "Whitey on the Moon," didn't really alleviate people's material lives back at home. And so a new political movement arose called the New Left out of the counterculture. So kind of the origins of the New Left came from a Marxist tradition called the Frankfurt School, which focused on how cultural production represses revolution. A guy called Herbert Marcuse, who was part of this, it's called critical theory, became known as the grandfather of the New Left because of his preaching about tolerance and how intolerance is inauthentic, and therefore can't lead to revolution. So this kind of like highfalutin Marxist theory affected the counterculture, and movements in places like Berkeley, California, where hold on, I'll get to this free speech movement a little bit later. But to define what the New Left is about, the main thing is equality and peace, right? The anti-war movement and civil rights were the mainstays of the New Left. And of course, multiculturalism became kind of the essential theory that that the New Left would push. This was support for the presence of and tolerance of several ethnic groups within the United States, rather than, basically cultural pluralism. Um, so this idea of tolerance really um, defined the New Left. But the problem was people like Ronald Reagan, for instance, did not like all of them protesting um, Californians. So the in 1960 there was the formation of the Students for a Democratic Society, which was not really clear what it was for at first, but especially after um, the Tet Offensive, it became it was very clear that it was basically the anti-war movement for students. But it had moved towards being in the anti-war movement by 1965, because students at Berkeley, California were protesting the war as early as 1964, but according to the rules at that point, any kind of political protests at the university was actually against the rules. So protests kept on getting broken up, and this even somehow applied off campus, where police would break up protests because students were involved and that was against the regent's rules. So this led to the need to protest just on behalf of the ability to protest, called the free speech movement. And from 1964 to 65, the free speech movement engaged in a bunch of sit-ins across campus, where they'd literally just take over a building by sitting in it, and then make a bunch of speeches and that kind of thing. These would often be violently broken up by campus police, even bringing in Berkeley police to help break up the movement, but they kept doing it and eventually won the right to protest the Vietnam War through for the sake of free speech on campus. This is kind of the beginning of the New Left as an actual political entity. A lot of the origins of the New Left are derived from fighting for free speech, and this led to things like the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, who in 1967 actually ran for president with a giant pig known as Pegasus. And their flag was a black flag with a red dot in the center, and in the red dot was a marijuana leaf. So, obviously these guys have a sense of humor in that. But the New Left was a political entity that was going to stay, and we'll see throughout much of the rest of American history has quite a bit of importance to American politics. You could basically say that currently one side of the political spectrum is the New Left, and the other side is what's called neoconservatism, which we'll get to in the Reagan lecture. But you'll notice that Reagan's already a political power in this, because he's governor of California, and doesn't exactly like all this stuff going on, to say the least. And so he moved further and further to the right as the counterculture took this New Left position. And there was a much more radical element to it than purely people campaigning for equality and peace, which really showed with hippie communes. So libertarian anarchists, or you could just call them socialists, were basically trying to create their own societies in these communes. They were basically utopian socialists, who would apply these kinds of new left principles and create, co-op farms and that. And this was kind of putting new left principles into practice. In 1967, there was the Friends of Perfection commune in San Francisco, which became kind of the archetype of communes to come, where they had like a free print shop where they would distribute their ideology, and they created what they called the free food conspiracy, where they would just give out food to people. And this became known as the cauliflower commune because they grew cauliflowers in San Francisco, and this kind of was the archetype for these communes. And so this was the radical arm of the New Left. But in 1968, when LBJ said that he wasn't going to run, and the Democratic National Convention ended up having a bunch of protests that were violently suppressed and all that kind of stuff, this led to the opposite party coming to power, and would lead to the ruining of this kind of great hope for the nation from the counterculture, because the person who was elected in 1968 was Richard Nixon. And Nixon would get a bad rap because of what he did later on in his presidency, but at first he actually kind of seemed to be quite liberal. Like you'll find for instance, on Wikipedia lists him as a conservative liberal because nobody knows how to classify him. But for instance, he created a few programs that appeased the New Left. For instance, the Environmental Protection Agency in 1969. He also created OSHA, which is the way that we protect, stop unfair labor practices, and make sure that workplaces are safe. So it's called the Occupational Safety and Health Act that created it. And this was seen as kind of like him doing well by the New Left. He even managed to secure what's called détente. You might remember from the Cold War lecture, where he basically ended tensions with the USSR. He opened up China in 1972, and most importantly, he ended the Vietnam War with the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Now, you might remember that he kind of dragged his feet in all of this. So these were seen as really good things, right? But we'll talk more about the energy crisis in next week. But he ended up supporting. Well, he didn't do it. It was actually LBJ who who initially started supporting Israel during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, but he also continued friendly relations with Israel to the detriment um, of um, uh, to the detriment of Arab League countries. And these Arab League countries had come together in 1946 to form what they call the OPEC, um, which are oil producing countries kind of forming a oil producing cartel. Um, and because of U.S. support, especially during the 1971 um, Israel Egypt war, the U.S. had supported them. It's called the Yom Kippur War. OPEC countries refused to sell oil to American resellers, which led to an oil crisis, and where it became really difficult to get oil. It became a scarce quantity. You'd see long lines for oil, and people would have to um, go to the gas station on excuse me would go to the gas station on like every other day they were allowed to go. So people with license plates that ended in 1 would be allowed to go on Mondays, and license plates that end on 2 would be allowed to go on Tuesdays. So this was a heck of a crisis, and it came on the back of what's called the Nixon shock, which throughout Nixon's presidency, he took the U.S. off of the gold standard completely, and this caused a huge amount of fluctuation in the economy and the rise of inflation and unemployment. So the U.S. really was hindered by this Nixon shock and oil crisis. We'll see that would not be the last time that the U.S. felt the energy crisis, but it did start getting the U.S. a lot more involved in the Middle East, for instance, to kind of prevent OPEC from doing this to us again. Nixon also engaged in a great deal of political suppression. He had the FBI tailing people that were he saw as political dissidents, and he even had an entire group called the White House Plumbers that would investigate dissident movements and publish misinformation or disinformation, and that they'd even find significant, somebody had a sex scandal or something like that, and use that as blackmail to try to suppress dissident political movements. And this really became prevalent in 1972 when he was reelected, and White House plumbers ended up going and raiding the Democratic Party's headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. This is why it's known as Watergate. But it took a couple years before the investigation managed to tie Nixon to these thieves. And he tried to cover it up. It became a huge scandal, and we'll talk about how that led to to a great deal of issues. But before that could even happen, um, the in 19 before Nixon ended up facing the repercussions of Watergate, his vice president Spiro Agnew had been found to have taken bribes, and so Agnew had to resign, which Nixon ended up elevating Gerald Ford to his vice presidency. And then later on that year, they connected Watergate to Nixon, and Nixon himself had to resign, even though he swore that he was not a crook. Turns out he was. And the Watergate scandal effectively ruined that confidence that that we saw throughout the long 1960s. And that will be what we talk about next week, is the crisis of confidence, the 1970s, also known as the pivotal decade. So you can see that this is a time of tremendous change, where there's the counterculture really pushes a whole new way of thinking. The space race inspires hope. Despite the protesting again for civil rights and against the Vietnam War really drives towards a new political movement. And even the Nixon administration has to push for more progressive things, such as the EPA and opening up China and ending the Vietnam War. But that crashes upon the rocks of Nixon's corruption. So, with all that being said, let me stop the screen share. There we go. So my question to you guys is, what do you think? What do you see of the new left in modern politics?
I mean, right now, what's considered the left part of modern day politics is the progressive side of politics, and I see a lot of similarities there, pushing for a lot of social rights, a lot of just liberal ideals. So I see a lot of connections between the new left and the current progressives.
So, when you're saying current progressives, who are you referring to?
Politicians like AOC, Elizabeth Warren to an extent, people who have progressive
So
politics. I'm
like
not
more left-leaning Democrats, right?
right. Yeah, further to the left than your standard Democrat. I'm not really. I don't really get invested in modern day politics, but those are a few I know of.
Mm-hmm. And you can see in these these politicians that they really embody a lot of new left ideals, especially that whole idea of multiculturalism, peace, and equality. Um, those are the mainstays of the new left. But you'll also notice that these are things more oriented around culture than economics in that. So the you can be you can be socially left leaning and fiscally right leaning, for instance. It's kind of what the Libertarian Party embodies today, but the um, these things are basically the remnants of the new left. Um, the This is still very important in our politics, but it's cultural rather than like what what we saw with social liberals, um, in terms of the New Deal and that. The new left is kind of different from that. So you still have, there still are social liberals around, but very few of them are. I'd actually say that AOC is more of a social liberal than a than New Left. Um, but I'd say more like Hillary Clinton is New Left, as opposed to AOC's kind of a social liberal. Um, but um, that's more referring to fiscal stuff than direct social programs. Um, besides, things like desegregation and that, of course, it gets really complicated when you start talking about um, the labels of politics. But um, the New Left also you can think of as being the political arm of the counterculture. And so with the counterculture, and perhaps the fight against it, which we'll see in the next lecture, well, the entire next week, has this lasting effect as well. So if you found the word counterculture on it, on the test, how would you say that it is historically significant?
The change in the culture allowed for not just cultural change, but
You're
political
very
change.
quiet.
That it allowed for not only a cultural change, but also a political change that carries on to this day.
Yeah. And what is that cultural and political change?
More social movements that tend to focus on people's rights.
Civil rights, yeah, that would be part of it. You know, definitely part of the counterculture, but um, there's also that's the equality part, but the other part in terms of peace. But why talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll?
I mean, it's part of. I mean, those things are part of the ideals in quotations of the counterculture, where it's basically liberation. They don't want many restrict. The counterculture was all about opening barriers, not a lot of restrictions. Do what you like as it comes, and which was just a culture of just they it was a culture that went against social. They wanted less social conformity and they wanted less social rules, where they wanted mostly just to do their own thing and let things play along, which is where the drugs come. It was about expanding the mind, but it was also just being free to do such things without conformity holding them back.
Yeah, that fight against conformity, right? Um, which is a great way of putting it. So with that being said, you guys want to listen to some rock music? We have another one of those playlists of that rock progression throughout the 1960s and 70s. But I found out in terms of the last time I did this, YouTube doesn't like the when you play rock music and upload that. So I can't record it. So I have to turn off the recording for that. So anybody who is listening in after this, too bad you don't get to listen to some rock music. um Gotta hit the stop button there.